Okay, my learners of P5, welcome once again for yet another lesson. Okay, this is our lesson 20 ever since we started. Okay, remember in the previous lesson, we opened up another topic, or we started looking at a new topic. Who can remind us that new topic that we started looking at? Do you still remember what we looked at? Yes, I can see some people just smiling around, a sign to show that they forgot what they learned on that day. Can you quickly remember? Yes, I can see some people are still running from wherever they've been. So, can we get settled so quickly? Let's do not waste time. Switch off whatever you were doing and get settled in that usual place where you study from. Don't forget the book and the pen alongside your pencil, okay? Yes, so I believe in those few minutes you might have remembered what we learned in the previous lesson, that new topic that we started on, okay? So I remember I left some work for you to do that I believe everyone did so neatly, okay? So you find maybe 1, 2 of our colleagues messed up with 1 or 2 questions. So we need to help them by going through that work very quickly. So our number 1 was talking about defining the term vegetation. So vegetation is the plant cover of an area. Vegetation is the plant cover of an area. Then question 2, what are the 2 types of vegetation? What are the 2 types of vegetation? So we talked of natural vegetation and planted vegetation. Then question 3, dash is the plant cover of an area that grows on its own. So what do we call that type of vegetation that grows on its own? That is natural vegetation. Remember, whenever you're starting a statement, you start with a capital letter. So in this case, when you're saying natural vegetation is the plant cover of an area that grows on its own, remember to start with capital N for the word natural. Then question 4. What do we call the type of vegetation that is grown by man? That is planted vegetation. That is planted vegetation. Then question 5, mention 1 type of natural vegetation. Mention 1 type of natural vegetation. So we looked at very many. You can talk about savanna vegetation. You can talk about the equatorial rainforests. You can talk about semi-desert vegetation. You can talk about the mountain vegetation, okay? So if there is any question that you didn't do well, then you can spare time and write the corrections so neatly, okay? So without wasting time, let's focus on today's lesson, okay? Where we are going to look at location of vegetation zones on the map of Uganda. I think you remember when we were looking at climate, we still had those zones, okay? The equatorial climatic zones, the semi-desert climatic zones. So for this case of the vegetation, you find those zones that experience the particular types of climate. They are the very zones that have those specific types of vegetation. Take an example, okay? An equatorial climatic zone. Which type of natural vegetation do you think grows there? Yes, automatically that is equatorial rainforest. Likewise to semi-desert climatic region, it has semi-desert vegetation, okay? So by the end of this lesson, I expect everyone to be able to locate the different vegetation zones on the map of Uganda. Then 2, to identify the factors that affect the vegetation distribution. Then 3, to state how different factors affect the vegetation distribution. Is that okay? So without wasting time, let's move to our session 1. And in this session, we are going to look at the location of the different vegetation zones on the map of Uganda. So which parts of Uganda do you think have savanna vegetation? You looked at how savanna vegetation looks like in our previous lesson. So which parts in Uganda do you think receive that type of vegetation? Can you quickly think about those places? You're moved around Uganda, you've been to different places. Can you identify them? Okay, let's quickly compare what you have come up with what I have here. So this is a map of Uganda trying to show the vegetation zones. So just like I said, when we're looking at the climate of Uganda, those specific regions that experience the specific types of climate, then they experience a particular type of vegetation. For instance, when you check this, if you were to recall very well, which type of climate is experienced in this region? This one here, okay? So somebody who recalls very well, this region experiences tropical climate. So in the tropical climatic regions, that's where we have savanna vegetation. So this one clearly shows that most parts of Uganda have savanna vegetation, okay? Then when we move to this side here, there is this portion with some blue color here, this one here, this is Karamoja or northeastern region, okay? So which type of climate is experienced within here? So basing on this, this one has semi-desert or semi-arid vegetation. Why? It experiences semi-desert climate. Then as we cross from somewhere here, we have some greenish color. It moves up to this end here. We have some here. So which type of climate is experienced within here? If you were to recall very well, this is equatorial climate. So areas within here have what we call equatorial rainforests. Equatorial rainforests or tropical rainforests. And then when you check this area, there is this reddish color here. Then even when you come this side, you can see what is here. So when you check with our key here, it shows you clearly that these areas with reddish color experience mountain or mountain climate, okay? Then for the case of swamp vegetation, always swamps are near water bodies. So around these water bodies, that's where we can also find the swamp vegetation. All the lakes that you see that are on this map, around them, we have what we call swamp vegetation. Is that clear to everybody? So put it in your mind that the climate experienced in an area has a very great influence on the vegetation that grows there. Is that okay? All right, we can now move on. In our session 2, I want us to talk about factors that influence or affect the vegetation distribution. To influence is to bring a change, and that change can be negative or positive. So when we talk about the factors that influence or affect the vegetation distribution, what causes? In this case, why do you think different areas have different kinds of vegetation? What brings about that? You go to Karamoja, you find they have semi-desert. You come to areas along the equator, they have equatorial rainforest. Which factors bring all about that? Okay? Then at the same time, what does vegetation distribution mean? When somebody talks about vegetation distribution, do you remember when you were looking at population in P4? There is a term that was related to this. It was population distribution. So, basing on that experience, what do you think vegetation distribution is? Okay, I see people scratching their heads. That's a very good sign that you're thinking, okay? Yes, let's compare what you have with what I have here, okay? So these are the factors that bring changes in the vegetation that is in the different areas, okay? So we have one of the factors is climate, we have drainage, we have relief, we have soil fertility, we have government policy, then we have the human activities. Don't fear, we are going to look at these factors one by one. What is very important is you listing these factors that influence or that bring changes in the vegetation in the different areas, okay? Yes, so these are the factors, and I promise that we will also talk about what vegetation distribution means. So vegetation distribution is the way vegetation is spread in an area. Vegetation distribution is the way vegetation is spread in an area. Is that clear? So you find different areas have different kinds of vegetation. So the way vegetation is spread in an area is what we refer to as vegetation distribution. Is that clear? All right. We can now move on to our session 3, in which we are going to talk about ways in which different factors affect the vegetation distribution. I think you have a list in your brain now: the climate, the soil fertility, the human activities. How do these ones bring a change in the vegetation of an area? Okay. So how do the following factors affect the vegetation distribution of an area? Take an example: human activities, then climate. How they cause a change? How they influence? How they affect the vegetation of an area? Can you please think about that with your colleague there? Yes, I can see children who are seriously discussing this. That is very important, okay? All right, let's now share. Let's compare what you have come up with what I have here, okay? So we are going to look at the ways in which different factors influence the vegetation. So starting with the climate, you find, remember, climate means majorly two things: temperature and rainfall. So in this case, we are going to majorly focus on the rainfall. And I want to quickly ask you, when you're living in an area that experiences a lot of rainfall, what happens with the vegetation there? Is it always thick or scattered? Okay, so you find areas that receive plenty of rainfall have thick vegetation. Areas that receive plenty of rainfall have thick vegetation. Then now, what happens to those places that receive little rainfall? So areas that receive little rainfall have scattered vegetation. You find one tree here, you move miles, you then get another one. So such vegetation is not in the same in the same place for areas that receive little or no rainfall, okay? Then it comes to latitude. When we talk about latitude, this is the distance in the north or south of the equator. So the distance from the equator is what we call latitude. So in this case, how does that distance affect the vegetation that grows in an area? So you find out that areas near the equator have thick vegetation. Is there anybody who can tell us, who can give us a reason why such areas along the equator have thick vegetation? Yes, to somebody who has been following seriously, you realize areas along the equator experience a lot of rainfall. So that a lot of rainfall is the cause for the thick vegetation. Then what happens to those places that are far away from the equator now? It means they experience little or no rainfall. Therefore, they will also have scattered vegetation. Is that clear? So you have two alternatives here. You can say areas near the equator have thick vegetation, or the other way around. Areas far away from the equator have scattered vegetation. Is that okay? All right. Yes, we also talked about drainage as one of the factors that affect or influence the vegetation distribution. So in this case, I want to quickly remind you, drainage refers to the underground water system. How does water appear in your area? Do you have swamps? Do you have lakes? What do you have there? How do you get the water that you have there? So in this case, you find out that areas near water bodies have thick vegetation. Areas near water bodies have thick vegetation, while areas far away from water bodies have scattered vegetation, okay? So when you check such a place, this place is near a water body, just the way you see it in the middle here. That's why you see this vegetation is very thick. It comes to those areas that are far away from water bodies, you find they experience very little rainfall, and therefore they will have scattered vegetation. Is that okay? All right. We also talked about relief. We talked about relief. This can also mean altitude, okay? Relief is the general appearance of land. How does land appear in your area? Is it mountainous? Is it in the form of a plateau? Does it have hills? So basing on the relief that you have in your area, okay? This one also determines the vegetation that is meant to grow there, okay? I can quickly remind you what altitude is. This is the height above the sea level. So at whatever level that you take as you're moving above, you get a different type or a different kind of vegetation. So these two factors are very important in determining vegetation, okay? I think you can see this is reflecting a mountainous area, and you can find at whatever altitude we get a different kind of vegetation, okay? So depending on the relief, that one can determine the vegetation that grows in an area. Then when we move here, we talked about soil fertility or nature of the soil. So soil can be fertile, soil can be infertile. So which soil do you think encourages plant growth? Which type of soil? Is it the infertile soil or the fertile soil? Yes, I see some people saying fertile soil, others are still thinking about this. So you find areas with fertile soils always have thick vegetation, and the other way around, areas with poor soils have scattered vegetation. So when you look at this picture here, I think it shows you that this man is putting these plants on fertile soil. And from here, we shall expect to have a very thick vegetation because that because that soil is very, very what? Fertile. You're going to drop your plants on dry land, you'll find yourself some plants will grow, then others will wither or will dry completely, okay? Then the government policies. We might be having vegetation in an area, just like you can see. Then the government declares a certain activity to be taken, to be carried out in that area. It can be mining, it can be road construction. So what will happen? During the mining or during the construction, they will cut down all the vegetation that is in that area. If it is mining, still the same thing will happen. You can see these guys. You find this area had vegetation, but since it had minerals, these guys came and cut down all the vegetation that was there, and they are now carrying out mining. Who allows such people to carry on such activities? The government. So it depends on the government policy, the government programs. The decision is taken by the government. Is that clear? Then, when we talk about human activities, these ones also greatly influence the vegetation of an area. For instance, if you're living in an area where they carry out such an activity, this is bush burning. Do you expect it to have there thick vegetation? You're living in an area where they carry out such an activity. Who can tell us what is this? Yes, I can see somebody saying this is deforestation. Do you expect to have thick vegetation in such an area? So you find good human activities encourage vegetation growth. Then it comes to bad human activities destroy the what? The vegetation, okay? So in this picture here, you can see what is taking place here. This is swamp drainage, okay? This was originally a swamp, and now these guys are clearing it away, either to construct the roads, okay, or to set up an industry. So this swamp drainage leads to destruction of our vegetation, okay? Then industrialization. You find initially this place had vegetation. So these guys who set up this factory, okay, came and cut down all the vegetation that was here, and they set up their factory or industry, okay? Then encroachment on forests. Every now and then the government is battling with the people who are cutting down our forests. For instance, you can see the whole of this area was a forest, okay? Some bad guys, I call them bad guys, because we need this vegetation. So anyone who comes and clears it away, I call that person very bad. I call that a bad person, because they might have cleared these trees here for reasons. One, they want to settle here, they want to carry out crop growing, okay? So do you expect vegetation to appear here if, for instance, somebody came and constructed here his house for settlement? Of course, no. Then road construction, I've already talked about that. It can also lead to destruction of our vegetation. So you can see in this picture, road construction is taking place. Then whatever we've been looking at, those have been bad human activities. Then we have these good human activities that can encourage the vegetation growth. One, we have afforestation. And quickly, afforestation is the planting of trees in a place where they have never been before, okay? You get a place that has never had any tree, just the way you see in this picture here. Then you start planting there your trees, and all of a sudden, they can form such a forest here. So that's what we refer to as afforestation, planting trees in a place where they have never been before. Let's look at other good activities. Yes, this is reforestation. When you check in this picture, this place originally had some vegetation, okay? Then some bad people came and cleared it away. So this lady you see is trying to replant, is trying to put back that vegetation that was destroyed. So we call this practice reforestation, the planting of trees in an area where the planting of trees in an area where they have ever been. The place originally had trees or had some grass, it was destroyed. Then later, you come and replant it. That is reforestation. Then another good activity that can encourage the vegetation growth is bush furrowing, okay? This one means you leaving your land for, let's say, 20 to 30 years without using it. So that one will also encourage the vegetation to grow in that area, okay? Yes, so as I wind up this lesson, we have had very common questions where they ask you, for example, how does climate affect the vegetation distribution? Or how does climate affect the vegetation of an area? So in this case, they are not asking you to compare. There is nothing you're going to compare in that question. So you have one alternative. You can either say places that receive plenty of rainfall have thick vegetation. That's one alternative. Or you can bring it the other way around by saying places that receive little or no rainfall have scattered vegetation. Likewise, when they talk about altitude, how does altitude affect or let's talk about human activities. How do human activities affect the vegetation of an area? Look at these two sides. We have good human activities and the bad human activities. So you can either say bad human activities lead to destruction of vegetation. That's one alternative. Or you can bring it the other way around and say good human activities encourage the growth of vegetation, okay? I want to thank you, my good children. I always want to have an activity for you to check those who have been following and those who have been absent-minded. So I'll leave behind this activity for you that I will expect you to do so neatly, okay? Thank you for listening.